Aunt Violet's inheritance. When the mailman delivered that thick envelope from Harrison and Associates law firm in San Francisco, I nearly tossed it in the trash with the rest of the junk mail. At 65, I'd received my share of those ridiculous letters, promising millions from supposedly deceased relatives in Nigeria. But the seal looked genuine, the paper felt expensive, and my name was written by hand in elegant script. Inside was an official notice about the death of my great-aunt Violet Sterling, along with a small velvet box. Aunt Violet, I hadn't seen her in 20 years, not since Uncle Charlie's funeral. I remembered her sitting in the corner, wearing her usual purple dress, quietly talking to herself and refusing refreshments because she was watching her figure. The family had always considered her a bit off, an old maid who lived alone in her San Francisco house, collected porcelain cats, and wrote letters to dead people. The attorney informed me that Aunt Violet had passed away peacefully in her sleep at 87 and had left me her sole inheritance. I opened the box and nearly laughed out loud. Inside lay the tackiest bracelet I'd ever seen. A chunky, silver-toned chain with enormous dangling stones in garish colors, bright red, orange, yellow, green, blue, and purple. The stones were so large and vivid, they looked like cheap rhinestones from a costume jewelry store. Next to it was a note written in Aunt Violet's familiar purple ink and spidery handwriting. Dearest Betty, you're the only one in the family who never thought I was crazy. Remember how you'd smile at me during family gatherings when others looked away? How you'd listen to my stories about travels that everyone else dismissed as fantasies? This bracelet is the key to what I've treasured my entire life. Follow the rainbow. Start with red. Don't judge by appearances, dear. Sometimes the most precious things hide behind a mask of ordinariness. Your loving Aunt V. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time, turning the bracelet over in my hands. Aunt Violet was right. I'd never considered her crazy, just lonely. There had always been such sadness in her eyes, as if she'd lost something precious and spent her whole life searching for it. Maybe that's why I always made time to talk with her, while other relatives discussed sports or politics. The next morning, curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to visit the jeweler. Not because I expected anything valuable, but simply to satisfy my wondering. Mr. Goldstein had run his shop on the corner of Main Street for 40 years, and if anyone could appraise a trinket, it was him. When I walked into his small store, crowded with antique clocks and jewelry, Mr. Goldstein was just polishing a vintage ring. He looked up with his usual professional smile and extended his hand for me to show him the bracelet. But the moment his eyes fell on it, his smile vanished. He reached for his jeweler's loupe and examined the first stone carefully, then the second, then the third. His hands trembled slightly as he looked up at me. Mr. Goldstein removed his glasses, cleaned them, put them back on, and studied the bracelet once more. I'll never forget the expression on his face in that moment. It was a mixture of awe, disbelief, and slight fear. He carefully placed the bracelet on a velvet cushion and leaned back in his chair. Mr. Goldstein explained that the red stone was a ruby of exceptional clarity, weighing at least 8 carats. The orange was a rare Padparadscha sapphire. The yellow, a canary diamond. The green, a Colombian emerald. The blue, a royal sapphire. The purple, an amethyst. But not just any amethyst, a deep saturated Uruguayan stone. He said such a collection was worth at least $200,000, possibly more. I listened to his words as if in a fog. My eccentric Aunt Violet, who'd worn the same purple dress to every family event and pinched pennies on electricity, had left me a bracelet worth a fortune. But what intrigued me most were the words from her note. Follow the rainbow. Start with red. I looked at the bracelet with new eyes. The stones were indeed arranged in rainbow order. Red, orange, yellow, green, blue, purple. This couldn't be a coincidence. I thanked the stunned Mr. Goldstein and, clutching the bracelet tightly, drove home. I needed to get to San Francisco. Aunt Violet's house hadn't been sold yet, and I had a key. The attorney had sent it with the bracelet, explaining that I needed to collect her personal belongings within a month. The next day, I got in my car and headed west. The 6-hour drive to San Francisco gave me plenty of time to think about Aunt Violet. I remembered her strange stories about traveling to Europe, which everyone dismissed as delusions. Her collection of postcards from different countries, how she always wore purple and said it was the color of royalty. Her house was in the Richmond district, on a quiet street lined with Victorian homes. I hadn't been there in years, and the house seemed smaller than in my childhood memories. The facade needed paint, and the garden was overgrown, but the overall impression was cozy and well-maintained. The key turned easily in the lock, and I stepped inside. It smelled of lavender and old books. In the living room stood that famous collection of porcelain cats everyone used to joke about. But now, knowing about the bracelet, I looked at everything differently. What if the cats weren't just a simple whim either? I began examining the house methodically, room by room. In Aunt Violet's bedroom hung framed photographs, landscapes and old buildings, but not a single picture with people. In the kitchen, a newspaper clipping about a charity fund for military widows was pinned to the refrigerator. In the study stood shelves of books about travel, history, and investments. The investment books surprised me. Among them were serious works on real estate, stocks, and bonds. Some were filled with margin notes in purple ink. Aunt Violet, it seemed, had been interested in finance. This didn't fit with the image of an eccentric old lady who counted every penny. In the living room, my attention was drawn to a painting above the fireplace. It was a watercolor landscape, the Golden Gate Bridge in morning fog, with a brilliant rainbow arcing above it. Something about this painting seemed familiar. I moved closer and noticed that the rainbow was painted with particular brightness, each color clearly defined. Follow the rainbow, start with red. I remembered Aunt Violet's words. I lifted the painting from the wall. Behind it was a small safe built into the wall. The metal door had a combination lock requiring 6 digits. My heart began beating faster. 6 digits, 6 stones in the bracelet. But what could be the connection? I took out the bracelet and studied each stone carefully. Weight? Size? What if? I remembered Mr. Goldstein's words. The ruby was 8 carats. But what about the others? I mentally estimated the sizes of the stones. If the ruby was 8 carats, then the orange padparacha looked slightly smaller. Maybe 7? The yellow diamond was larger. 9 or 10? The green emerald was medium. 6? The blue sapphire was large. 12? And the purple amethyst was the smallest. 5? I tried entering. 8, 7, 10, 6, 12, 5. Click! The safe door opened. Inside lay a stack of documents, several photographs, and a thick diary with a purple cover. I carried everything to the coffee table and spread it out. First, I picked up the photographs. One showed a young woman in a white dress standing beside a handsome man in military uniform. The bride looked remarkably like Aunt Violet, only young and happy, happier than I'd ever seen her. On the back was written, "Violet and James, Las Vegas, June 15th, 1952. The happiest day of my life." The next photograph showed the same man in uniform, but alone this time. The inscription read, "My dear Jim, before shipping out to Korea, July 1952. I examined the documents. A marriage certificate for Violet Sterling and Captain James Campbell, registered June 15th, 1952, in Las Vegas, Nevada. A notice from the War Department that Captain Campbell had been killed in action on August 14th, 1952. Documents authorizing a military widow's pension. But the most surprising were the bank statements and property deeds. Aunt Violet owned 4 houses in San Francisco, 3 apartments, a plot of land in Napa, and an impressive stock portfolio. The total value of her assets exceeded $5 million. I opened her diary with trembling hands. The first entry was dated 1953. It's been a year since Jim died. The family thinks I'm going mad with grief. But actually, I've never thought more clearly. I have his pension, modest savings, and an enormous desire to live the life we had planned together. Jim always said San Francisco was the city of the future, that real estate here would only get more expensive. I bought my first house on Richmond Street, small, but mine. The following entries told the story of Aunt Violet's remarkable business acumen. She bought houses in promising neighborhoods when they were still cheap, rented them out, and reinvested the profits. By the 1960s, she had a solid real estate portfolio. The relatives think I'm eccentric, and that's perfect. While they assume I'm spending money on porcelain cats and imaginary travels, I'm building an empire. Jim would be proud. Every house purchased, every successful investment is our joint project, even though he's no longer beside me. In entries from the 1970s, I found the explanation for the bracelet. Today marks 20 years since Jim's death. I commissioned a special bracelet. Each stone symbolizes one of our houses and the years I bought them. The ruby for the first house that gave me strength to continue living. The Padparaja for the Mission District house, as rare and special as our love. The diamond for the downtown apartments that shine like stars in the sky we dreamed of living under together. The emerald for the Napa plot, green like our plans for a country home. The sapphire for the oceanfront house, blue like Jim's eyes. And the amethyst, my favorite color, the color of loyalty and memory. Later entries became more philosophical. The family thinks I'm a lonely old maid who never managed to find a husband. If only they knew that I talk to Jim every day, that I make all my decisions consulting with him, that every house purchased is our mutual choice. I wear mourning for him, but not grief. Grief destroys, but love creates. In a 1985 entry, Aunt Violet wrote about why she chose me specifically. Yesterday was little Betty's birthday. She's only 35, but I see understanding in her eyes. When I tell stories about my travels, and I do travel, just not the way others think. I travel through memories. She listens, doesn't interrupt or roll her eyes. She's the only one who smiles at me simply because, expecting nothing in return. I think she's the one I'll leave everything Jim and I created to. The final entry was made just a month before her death. I feel time drawing to a close. The doctors say my heart is weakening, but I know the truth. It's simply tired of waiting. Soon I'll see Jim again. All the documents are prepared. Betty will receive our inheritance. I hope she understands that wealth isn't just money. It's the opportunity to live a full life, help others, and not be afraid to dream. I've lived a good life. Yes, it seemed lonely to others, but for me it was full of love. I closed the diary and sat in the silence of Aunt Violet's house for a long time. Around me were the testimonies of an extraordinary life lived by a woman everyone considered slightly crazy. But she had turned out to be a wise businesswoman, faithful wife, and romantic dreamer, all at once. In the document folder, I found an envelope with my name on it. Inside was a final letter from Aunt Violet. Dearest Betty, if you're reading this, you've solved the bracelet's mystery. I always knew you were a smart girl. Now you know my story. Jim and I were married only 2 months, but those 2 months were worth a lifetime. When he died, I could have drowned in sorrow, but instead I chose to live for both of us. Everything I created is now yours. $5 million, 6 properties, a stock portfolio. But most importantly, I'm leaving you the opportunity to live as you choose. Don't let others dictate what's right or wrong for you. The family will be surprised, perhaps even outraged. But remember, I didn't choose you by accident. I have one request. Create something important in memory of women who lost their husbands to war. I've wanted to help them all my life, but was afraid to draw attention to my wealth. Now you can do this. And one more thing. Wear this bracelet sometimes. It doesn't matter what others say about its appearance. Remember that the most valuable things often hide behind a mask of ordinariness. Just as my love for Jim hid behind a mask of eccentricity. Live a full life, dear, for both of us. Your loving Aunt Violet. P.S. The porcelain cats aren't ordinary either. Look inside the white cat on the mantelpiece. I went to the mantelpiece and found the white porcelain cat among the collection. On the bottom was a small cork. Inside the cat were keys and the address of a bank safety deposit box. The next day, I went to the bank. The box contained originals of all the documents, several more photographs of Jim and Violet, and a small box with a wedding ring. A simple gold band with an inscription inside. V and J forever. The drive home was spent in contemplation. My life had changed dramatically in just a few days. I was no longer just Betty, a retiree living on a modest pension. I had become the heir to a fortune and, more importantly, the guardian of an extraordinary love story. A month later, I sold my house and moved to San Francisco, into Aunt Violet's home. I established the Violet and James Charitable Foundation to help military widows. I opened a small cafe on the ground floor of one of her houses, where lonely elderly women gather to drink tea, share stories, and support each other. And I wear Aunt Violet's bracelet. Not every day, but on special occasions. People sometimes comment on its brightness, but I just smile. They don't know that beneath these cheap rhinestones lies a story of great love and wisdom. Every morning, waking up in her house, I think about Aunt Violet and Jim, about how she managed to transform tragedy into triumph, loneliness into strength, and love into a legacy that will help people for years to come. Sometimes in the evenings, I sit in her chair by the window, look at the Golden Gate Bridge, and talk to Aunt Violet. I tell her about the Foundation's work, whom we've helped, whose lives we've changed. And it seems to me that she's listening and approving, because the most valuable things really do often hide behind a mask of ordinariness, like love that lasts longer than life, like wisdom that masquerades as eccentricity, like an inheritance measured not just in money, but in the opportunity to change the world for the better. The bracelet taught me something crucial. Never judge by appearances, not people, not things, not circumstances. Behind every simple story might hide a great mystery. Behind every lonely woman, an amazing destiny. And behind every cheap bracelet, treasures worth more than all the money in the world. But there was more to discover about Aunt Violet's extraordinary life, more secrets hidden in plain sight throughout her house. As I settled into my new reality, I began to understand that the bracelet was just the beginning of her carefully orchestrated revelation. The porcelain cat collection, I soon learned, was far from innocent. Each cat contained something, sometimes keys to safety deposit boxes, sometimes rolled up stock certificates, sometimes simply notes with investment advice written in Violet's careful script. The white Persian held bank keys. The black Siamese contained the deed to her Napa property, and the tabby near the window held a list of her stock holdings with detailed notes about when to buy and sell. It became clear that Aunt Violet had spent decades not just building wealth, but creating an elaborate treasure hunt for whoever would eventually inherit her legacy. Every seemingly eccentric habit had purpose. Her collection of travel postcards weren't random souvenirs. They marked the locations of her various investments. A postcard from Napa Valley corresponded to her vineyard property. One from downtown San Francisco marked her commercial building. European postcards indicated her international stock holdings. The books in her study told another story entirely. Between the pages of Pride and Prejudice, I found love letters from Jim, carefully preserved between tissue paper. In The Great Gatsby, she'd hidden photographs of their brief honeymoon in Las Vegas. Her copy of Gone with the Wind contained maps of San Francisco neighborhoods with notes about which areas would be good investments and why. As I read through more of her diary entries, I discovered that Aunt Violet hadn't just been a savvy investor, she'd been years ahead of her time in understanding market trends. In 1962, she'd written, "Everyone thinks the Haight-Ashbury district is going downhill with all these young people moving in. But I see opportunity. Young people grow up, get jobs, want to stay in neighborhoods they know. I'm buying 2 houses there. Those houses were now worth over $1 million each." Her investment philosophy was sophisticated yet simple. Buy what others fear, sell what others love, and always think 20 years ahead. She'd applied this to everything from real estate to stocks to bonds. While other investors panicked during market downturns, Violet saw opportunities. But perhaps most remarkably, I discovered that her philanthropy had begun decades before her death. Hidden in various accounts were records of anonymous donations to military widow support groups, veterans hospitals, and scholarships for children of fallen soldiers. She'd been quietly helping others for 30 years, all while maintaining her facade of eccentric frugality. The most touching discovery came in a shoebox hidden behind her winter coats. Inside were hundreds of thank you notes from people she'd helped, military widows who'd received anonymous rent payments during difficult months, veterans who'd gotten medical care they couldn't afford, children who'd received scholarships with no idea where the money came from. One letter particularly moved me. It was from a woman named Margaret, whose husband had died in Vietnam. She wrote, "I don't know who you are, but your monthly help allowed me to keep my house when everything seemed impossible." My children grew up in that house, graduated from school, went to college. One is now a doctor. One is a teacher. They're both changing the world in their own ways. You saved not just me, but generations of my family. Thank you, mysterious angel. I realized that Aunt Violet had been living multiple lives simultaneously. To her family, she was the eccentric old maid. To the investment community, she was a sharp-eyed property owner who preferred to work through lawyers and rarely appeared in person. To the beneficiaries of her charity, she was an anonymous guardian angel. And in her private moments, she was Jim's eternal wife, making every decision as if he were still beside her. The house itself revealed more secrets as I lived in it. Behind a loose board in the basement, I found wartime ration books and Jim's dog tags. In the attic, wrapped in careful tissue paper, was her wedding dress, preserved as if she might wear it again someday. Hidden in the kitchen pantry was a bottle of champagne with a note, "For the day Jim comes home," dated 1952. These discoveries painted a picture of a woman who had loved so deeply and purely that she'd spent 40 years living as if her husband might return at any moment. Yet, she'd also been practical enough to build a fortune and wise enough to use that fortune to help others. The cafe I opened in her honor became more popular than I'd expected. Women came not just for coffee and conversation, but seeking the kind of community Aunt Violet had created through her anonymous charity. They shared stories of loss and resilience, of dreams deferred and hopes renewed. Many were military widows themselves, drawn by word of mouth about our foundation's work. One afternoon, an elderly woman named Ruth came in carrying a faded photograph. She approached me hesitantly and asked if I was the niece of Violet Sterling. When I confirmed I was, she smiled through tears. "Your aunt saved my life," Ruth said simply. "My husband died in Korea in 1952. Same as hers. I was pregnant, alone, and about to lose my apartment. For 10 years, someone paid my rent anonymously. I tried to find out who, but the lawyer would never tell me. It wasn't until I saw the newspaper article about your foundation that I put the pieces together. The lawyer was the same one who handled your aunt's estate." Ruth pulled out the photograph. It showed her as a young woman holding a baby, standing in front of a small apartment building. On the back, in Violet's handwriting, was Margaret Ruth Davidson, 1953. Strong women survive. Help her thrive. She didn't just send money, Ruth continued. She sent hope. That baby in the picture is my son David. He became a surgeon because someone believed in us when no one else did. He saved thousands of lives. All because your aunt saw potential where others saw only problems. These encounters happened regularly. A teacher whose education had been funded by anonymous scholarships that we now knew came from Violet. A veteran whose medical bills had been mysteriously paid. A widow whose children had received Christmas presents for years from an unknown benefactor. Each story added depth to my understanding of Aunt Violet's true character. She hadn't been eccentric. She'd been extraordinarily empathetic. She hadn't been isolated. She'd been connected to her community in ways no one realized. She hadn't been living in the past. She'd been investing in the future. The bracelet, I came to understand, represented more than her properties or her love for Jim. Each stone symbolized a life principle she'd lived by. The ruby for passion, the driving force behind all her decisions. The Padaparadsha for rarity, her appreciation for the unique and precious in everyday life. The diamond for brilliance, her sharp mind and clear vision. The emerald for growth, her belief in nurturing potential. The sapphire for loyalty, her unwavering faithfulness to Jim's memory and her commitment to others. The amethyst for wisdom, the deep understanding that guided her choices. As I continued managing her estate and expanding the foundation's work, I discovered that Violet's influence extended far beyond San Francisco. Property records showed she'd owned rental properties in 3 states, always choosing buildings and neighborhoods that were transitioning, offering affordable housing to working families and recent immigrants. Her stock portfolio revealed similar patterns. She'd invested heavily in companies that employed veterans, supported education, or developed medical technologies. Her financial advisor, whom I finally met 6 months after her death, told me she'd insisted on socially responsible investing decades before the term became popular. Mrs. Sterling was remarkable, he said. She'd research every investment not just for profit potential, but for social impact. She wanted her money to do good while it grew. I've never met anyone who thought so systematically about the ripple effects of their financial decisions. The more I learned about Aunt Violet, the more I realized that everything she'd done had been intentional, planned and executed with precision. Even her eccentricity had been calculated, a way to deflect attention while she worked behind the scenes to help others. Her diary revealed the depth of this planning. In a 1978 entry, she'd written, "Betty asked me today why I collect so many postcards. I told her they remind me of places I'd like to visit. She smiled and said maybe someday we could travel together. Sweet child, she doesn't know that each postcard represents a piece of our future together. Hers and mine and Jim's. Someday she'll understand that we can travel through time and purpose, not just geography." By the end of my first year in San Francisco, the foundation had helped over 300 military families. The cafe had become a neighborhood institution, and I had transformed from a retiring retiree into an active philanthropist and businesswoman. Roles I'd never imagined for myself. But the most profound change was in how I viewed my own life. Aunt Violet had shown me that age was no barrier to reinvention, that love could be a source of strength rather than just grief, and that true wealth was measured by the positive impact you had on others' lives. I still wore her bracelet to important events, and each time someone complimented its unusual beauty, I shared a piece of Violet's story. Her legacy was spreading beyond the people she'd directly helped, inspiring others to look beneath surface appearances and find the extraordinary hidden in the ordinary. On the anniversary of Jim's death, I visited their shared grave. Yes, she'd bought the plot next to his decades ago and had waited 40 years to join him. I left a rainbow of flowers, one for each colored in her bracelet, and told them both about the lives their love continued to touch. As I walked away from the cemetery that day, I understood finally that Aunt Violet's greatest gift hadn't been the money or the properties. It had been showing me that a life guided by love, wisdom, and service to others was the most valuable inheritance of all. The bracelet rested against my wrist as I drove home, its stones catching the sunlight and throwing tiny rainbows across the dashboard. "Follow the rainbow," she'd said. "Start with red." I followed it to discover not just treasure, but purpose, community, and a deeper understanding of what it meant to live fully. And I knew that somewhere, somehow, Aunt Violet was smiling that quiet, knowing smile she'd always worn, the smile of a woman who'd kept her greatest secrets not out of shame, but out of love.